That moment when you realized you were the villain in someone else's story. We've all been there, completely convinced we were doing the right thing, maybe even the noble thing, only to look back later and realize we'd caused real harm. Whether it was a relationship decision, a workplace situation, or even something as simple as how we treated someone we disagreed with. What's your story? What made you see things differently? Now, back to why this video was made. It was hard to initially cover the details of this story. I remain sane because I convinced myself that there's so much evil in this world, and this is the worst I'll ever hear. None of this happened in Chicago or Atlanta or Wisconsin or any state you think in the US. Not everything terrible happens here. Strange, isn't it? Where did it happen? Time for you to find out. I'll start the story of Elizabeth with her fleeing. From who? And why? She had even made it to Vienna once, but when the police handed her back, his words sealed her fate. She would never escape again. And she didn't. Here in the modest Austrian town of Amstetten, on April 9th, 1935, a boy named Joseph was born, though nothing about his early life was ordinary. His family's history was already tangled long before he took his first breath. His grandmother, Anna, couldn't have children, so her husband found other women, 3 of the household servants, to bear him heirs. One of those children, born out of wedlock, was Maria, Joseph's mother. Maria married a poor man, also named Joseph, and soon they had a son. That boy would carry his grandmother's maiden name, Fritzl, while his father's name faded into the background. By the time Joseph was almost 3, the world around him was shifting. In March 1938, Hitler's troops marched into Austria. Days later, Hitler himself arrived, greeted by roaring crowds. Among them, perched on his father's shoulders, was little Joseph, watching history unfold. But history was not kind to the Fritzls. Maria had a temper that did not fit neatly into Nazi expectations. She angered the regime, was arrested, and spent months in a concentration camp. Joseph, told his mother was dead, was sent to an orphanage. His father fought on the Eastern Front, was captured by the Russians, and returned years later, a stranger shunned by his own family. When the war ended, Maria came back, but not softened. She was unpredictable, aggressive. She beat her son regularly, more out of frustration than discipline. Joseph grew up in a home without warmth, without gentleness. And something began to change in him. At 15, he pushed back against her attacks. But he also began lurking, peering into the lives of others, crossing invisible lines, behaviors that hinted at something brewing deep inside. By 16, he left Amstetten for Linz, learning engineering, building a life far from the walls that raised him. There he met Rosemary, a quiet, obedient young woman whose father worked alongside him. She was 17. He told friends she'd make a good wife. By 1963, barely 7 years into their marriage, they already had 3 children, the perfect picture of a young family. But like all perfect pictures, the cracks were invisible, until it was far too late. It's easy to picture him in those post-war years, a man who had shed the skin of the shabby, unwanted boy and stepped into the confidence of a skilled engineer. Austria needed men like him. There was work, money, and for Josef Fritzl, the intoxicating sense of authority that came with both. His employer sent him to Ghana, and when he returned in 1965, the man who walked back into his home was more certain, more commanding, and more dangerous. 3 children were already growing up under his roof. He handled this the way he handled most things, through control, violence. Rosemary, dutiful and silent, fell pregnant again. On April 8, 1966, Elizabeth was born. She entered a household where fear was the air everyone breathed. Back in Linz, Fritzl's old appetites returned. He slipped easily into the red light district, away from Amstetten's prying eyes. But it wasn't enough. In 1967, he followed a young mother home, broke into her house, and raped her at knife point as her child slept beside her. The sentence, just 18 months. Under Austrian law, after 15 years, it would be erased, as if it never happened. Rosemary forgave him without a word. She even visited him in prison. By 1972, there were 7 children, 4 girls, 3 boys. The engineer's reputation grew, respectable, even enviable. In 1973, he expanded into property, buying the Zorn Guest House near Lake Mondsee. He collected restaurants, guest houses, and when profits faltered, one of them conveniently burned down. Suspected insurance fraud, though never proven. By 1978, he had grand plans for their home at 40 Eibstrasse, a roof terrace, 9 new flats, and a large cellar, bigger than most would find reasonable. The plans were approved. Work began. Walls went up above ground, but below, a maze of rooms slowly took shape. It was the perfect stage for the dual life he lived. To the public, a businessman, a father, a man who sent his children to school. In private, a man with dangerous fixations, especially on one child, Elizabeth. She reminded him of himself at her age. He watched her constantly, followed her, kept her tethered to the house. She had friends, twins, Uta and Krista, girls who sensed something was wrong, but never spoke it aloud. Even as Elizabeth began studying tourism and gastronomy in Weidhofen, working at a petrol station to support herself, Fritzl's obsession deepened. He exposed himself to her, slipped pornographic magazines under her pillow. The abuse became a private, unspoken truth. Then, on January 28, 1983, she ran away. She was still a minor, and police found her in Vienna. They called her father. He drove to collect her, and in the car, he promised she would never be allowed to run away again. For Elizabeth, it wasn't a promise. It was a sentence. The cellar was no longer just concrete and shadows. It had been shaped with purpose. Interconnected rooms, electric lighting, and careful craftsmanship gave it the appearance of a workshop or storage space. But for Josef Fritzl, it was more than that. It was the ultimate private domain, the place he had longed for since boyhood. And in 1984, it would become the stage for his most monstrous act. That May, Elizabeth, now 18, announced she was moving to nearby Linz to live with her sister. For Fritzl, this was not merely inconvenient, it was a threat. She was the focus of his obsession, the victim of his ongoing abuse. If she left, she could speak. She could expose him. And so, in his mind, there was only one option: stop her from leaving forever. On August 28, 1984, he carried a heavy door into the garage, an ordinary enough sight in a household under renovation. He called Elizabeth into his study under the pretense of discussing something in private. When she turned her back, he pressed a chloroform-soaked rag to her face. She collapsed. He carried her down into the hidden cellar, a space no one else knew existed. Inside, there was nothing but a bed, a small TV, and a chain. He shackled her there, sealing her away from the world. To buy himself time and eliminate suspicion, Fritzl forced Elizabeth to write a letter claiming she had joined a cult and didn't want to be found. He drove 100 miles away to mail it. In the early days of her disappearance, the police treated it as a missing person case. British-born journalist Mark Perry, working in Austria, recalls the first time he heard her name. It was when local police asked him to print her picture. "We're looking for her desperately," they told him. "It looks like a crime, but we don't know what happened." To the public, Fritzl was the distraught father, pleading for news. Behind closed doors, Elizabeth was chained like an animal, raped and beaten. In 1988, after years of repeated assaults, she became pregnant and carried the child to term. In the humid, airless dark, she gave birth alone, armed only with a book on childbirth, a towel, scissors, and a few nappies. The baby girl, Kerstin, was the first of 7 children she would have in captivity. 2 years later, in 1990, her son Stefan was born. By 1991, Elizabeth had been imprisoned for almost 7 years, raising 2 children in the suffocating confines of the cellar while life upstairs carried on as if she didn't exist. In August 1992, she gave birth to a 3rd child, Lisa, who was born with a serious heart defect. Lisa's constant crying in the so-called soundproof cellar alarmed Fritzl. Noise risked discovery. Elizabeth also begged him to help. His solution was chilling but calculated. He placed the baby on the doorstep upstairs with another letter, supposedly from Elizabeth, asking her parents to care for the child. Rosemary and Joseph, her grandparents, though they believed themselves foster parents, took Lisa in. The infant underwent emergency surgery and began life upstairs, while her mother remained a prisoner below. By now, the cellar was becoming cramped. Fritzl expanded it, adding more space, a fridge, toys, even pets, a goldfish and a canary. On the surface, it looked like kindness, but it was just another form of control. Everything that entered their world came through him. In December 1994, another baby arrived on the doorstep, Monica, along with another letter from Elizabeth. Rosemary adopted her, too. When the second doorstep baby appeared, police again contacted Mark Perry to run the story. "We have this funny case," they told him. "Another baby. No one knows where the mother is. The children deserve a real mum." In public, Fritzl played the desperate, loving father, spinning tales of Elizabeth being trapped in a satanic cult. Even Perry admits he believed it then, calling Elizabeth a terrible mother before realizing the horrifying truth. On April 28, 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, Michael and Alexander. The cellar's population, and the nightmare, was still growing. The cellar beneath 40 Ibstrasse had transformed into something far beyond a mere storage space. Josef Fritzl, the engineer, had meticulously redesigned it, with lighting, interconnecting rooms, and hidden craftsmanship, turning that space into the perfect prison. His crimes escalated grotesquely. By the time Elizabeth's 7th child, Michael, was born, the toddler was gravely ill. His breathing labored. Fritzl shockingly allowed Michael to die, then, in a hideous effort to erase the evidence, burned the boy's body in the house's furnace. Only Alexander, the second twin, remained. Fritzl could not risk Alexander dying as well, so the grim cycle continued. Another baby, left on the Fritzl family doorstep as a foundling, appeared at 40 Ibstrasse on the main street of Amstetten. Framed as ordinary, everyday, this scene seemed benign. Hard to believe that no one noticed 3 infants sequentially abandoned there. Yet, in that average Austrian town, evil masqueraded as banal normalcy, living on the same quiet street where neighbors strolled past, unknowing. To understand how Elizabeth survived 2 decades in that darkness, one has to consider her indomitable resilience and the psychological phenomenon known as Stockholm Syndrome. She learned to adapt and even comply because survival meant submission. Fritzl's psychological control was total. He convinced her the cellar was trapped with gas sensors, locking mechanisms, even electronic alarms. He left her believing escape was impossible. Yet despite these horrors, Fritzl still coveted more control and more distance. He took frequent work trips, leaving Elizabeth and the children isolated and unsupervised, from weeks at a time. They had provisions, yes, but no help. A fire, a medical emergency, a breakdown, anything could have happened. But Fritzl returned from vacations, calm and restored. By December 2002, Elizabeth had been imprisoned for 18 years. Her children, Ken, 14, and Stefan, 12, had lived their entire lives underground, never felt the sunlight, never experienced the world above. Despite such extremity, a final child, Felix, was born. Symbolically, Fritzl now had 7 legitimate children above, and by this incestuous birth, 7 children below, a ghastly mirroring. Fritzl surprisingly appeared to develop pragmatic concerns for Felix, wanting him to inherit his illicit world, to join the normal one. He began considering ways to integrate parts of the hidden family with his legitimate one, but sending Felix to school posed a risk. Another foundling wouldn't be possible without arousing suspicion. Then came mid-March 2008. 19-year-old Ken fell seriously ill. Medically, she needed more than aspirin. Elizabeth, with rare defiance, insisted Fritzl take Ken to the hospital. That would be the first time in 24 years that one of the Cellar children had any contact with healthcare professionals. Elizabeth quietly drew a line. She would not let another of her children die. She leveraged his pragmatism, but with that heartbreaking resolve, she forced him to act. Elizabeth helped her father carry Kerstin upstairs before returning to join Stefan and Felix, along with the doctor at the hospital. Dr. Reiter needed more medical information, but without the mother present, no one could answer his questions. A television appeal went out, asking Elizabeth to come forward, an appeal she saw on her television in the cellar. Elizabeth's world changed forever on Saturday, April 26th. She persuaded Joseph that she needed to go to the hospital to explain what had been happening to Kerstin. Joseph agreed, taking her to the hospital, where Dr. Reiter interviewed her, trying to gather as much information as possible. Once that interview ended, police arrested Elizabeth, took her into a separate room, and began interrogating her. It was only when they threatened to take away her children that Elizabeth finally revealed for the first time what Joseph Fritzl had been doing to her for the past 24 years. At that point, police arrested Joseph Fritzl, and the game, in effect, was up. Fritzl freed Stefan and Felix at the same time as releasing Elizabeth. When asked about the condition of Stefan and Felix at their release, it was confirmed they were in very bad shape. Fritzl had attempted to provide care for them, bringing vitamin supplements and lamps to counteract vitamin D deficiency, but they had never been exposed to sunlight. Their skin was pale, they had multiple infections from the filth and humidity of the cellar, and the space was infested with bacteria and insects. By Sunday, April 27th, news of Elizabeth's 24 years of enslavement had spread. The press began arriving, and forensic experts entered the cellar at 40 Ibstrasse in Amstetten. The years of abuse and rape had ended, but now the family had to adapt to a strange new life outside. The world's attention was initially focused on Elizabeth's first child, 19-year-old Kerstin, who was critically ill in the hospital. Doctors described a moving moment when Kerstin slowly opened her eyes, looked around, and said the first thing she wanted was to watch a Robbie Williams concert. Her second statement was, "A new life is starting for all of us. Let us be happy." Little Felix experienced his first car ride in his life that same day. Pressing his nose to the window, he stared silently at the lights and the moonlight, both sights he had never seen before. His lips and nose stayed pressed against the glass, wide-eyed, saying nothing, absorbing his first look at normal life. On April 27th, Colonel Franz Polzer, head of Lower Austria's criminal police, held an impromptu press conference. He revealed to the world that Joseph Fritzl had imprisoned his daughter in his cellar for 24 years and had fathered several children with her. The Austrian press reaction was chaotic. Newsreaders themselves appeared in disbelief as they read from the local police press release. Within 2 days, Amstetten was overrun with about 800 camera crews, journalists, interpreters, fixers, TV vans, and satellite dishes. Authorities promised to investigate how such a shocking crime could happen in Austria. At the same time, a backlash arose against international coverage, especially from English-speaking tabloids, which was seen as intrusive. These outlets demanded images and personal details from the family, but Elizabeth refused then, and refuses to this day, to be photographed or to speak publicly. She does not want her story told by herself or her family, nor does she want them in the spotlight. Following his arrest, Josef Fritzl's crimes were fully exposed to the public, and Austria, along with the rest of the world, was left reeling in horror. In March 2009, the Austrian authorities ordered a full psychiatric evaluation of 73-year-old Josef Fritzl, the man whose crimes had shocked the world. The court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Adelheid Kastner, was tasked with the responsibility of looking into his mental state, his motives, and whether his actions were driven by insanity or by a deep-rooted and profound personality disorder. Dr. Kastner, who had assessed many criminal cases in her career, later admitted that this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. She described standing in the cellar where Fritzl had imprisoned his daughter, Elizabeth, for 24 years, and feeling the weight of time press upon her. She tried to imagine what 2.5 decades meant, to think back to where she had been 24 years ago, what had happened in her own life during that span, and it felt endless, impossible to truly comprehend. The cellar was not a single space, but a twisted network of hidden rooms. Fritzl had constructed it in such a way that it was both concealed and suffocatingly secure. The entry began with a cupboard that hid a heavy reinforced door, just 1 meter by 1 meter in size. This door was built with a metal frame and filled with concrete, forcing anyone passing through to crouch down on their knees to get inside. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor that led to another door of the same size and design, requiring the same awkward movement. Only after squeezing through this second barrier could one reach the provision room, where shelves and a refrigerator stood. From there, the space opened into the living quarters, though living hardly described the conditions. The rooms were cramped but tall enough to stand in, yet they were damp, stale with rot, and oppressive with humidity. Machine parts were scattered about. There was a writing desk and various clutter. It was a labyrinth built not for comfort, but for concealment and control. On the 16th of March 2009, Fritzl was brought to trial in St. Pölten, the capital of Lower Austria. The charges were as severe as they were numerous: rape, enslavement, incest, coercion, deprivation of liberty, and the murder of one of the children conceived through his abuse, a baby who died shortly after birth because Fritzl refused to seek medical help. At the start of proceedings, Fritzl entered a plea of not guilty to murder and some other charges, though he admitted to others. His demeanor in court was described as polite and unemotional, answering questions but otherwise sitting still, almost like a statue. Observers noted the chilling absence of visible remorse. That changed on the day Elizabeth's testimony was played. Her account had been video recorded to spare her the trauma of recounting the details in person, but she made the decision to appear in court on the final day of her evidence being presented. In the recording, she described in harrowing detail the brutality of her captivity. She spoke of how her father had raped her repeatedly, controlled every aspect of her existence, and subjected her to conditions that could only be described as inhumane. She made it clear she never saw herself as anything resembling a partner in this, an assertion that contrasted sharply with Fritzl's earlier claims that he and Elizabeth had a sort of arrangement. To her, it had always been pure criminality, a life defined by domination, fear, and pain. Elizabeth's testimony cut through the last of his defenses. Those in the courtroom reported that Fritzl was visibly shaken, even brought to tears as he listened. It was the first time in her life, over 40 years, that Elizabeth was in a position where she could look him in the eye as a free woman, independent, with his power over her broken. Her presence in court was described as an act of defiance, her way of confronting him publicly and ensuring his crimes were fully exposed. Witnesses said this moment broke through his carefully maintained facade. he changed his plea to guilty on all counts. The trial lasted just 4 days, but in that short span, the evidence presented painted a complete and horrific picture of 24 years of captivity. The prosecution laid out how Fritzl had trapped Elizabeth when she was 18, luring her into the cellar under the pretense of needing her help to carry a door. Once inside, he incapacitated her and sealed her away. Over the decades, she bore him 7 children. 3 of these children were raised underground alongside her, never seeing daylight until their rescue in 2008. 3 others were taken upstairs by Fritzl and his wife, Rosemary, under the story that Elizabeth had joined a religious sect and left the children in their care. One newborn died shortly after birth, the child whose death formed the basis of the murder charge. When Fritzl refused to take the baby to a hospital despite Elizabeth's pleas, he incinerated the body in a furnace. The conditions in the cellar were oppressive and deteriorating. The lack of sunlight and ventilation caused constant dampness. The smell of mold and decay lingered in the air. Elizabeth and the children endured years without proper medical care, education, or freedom of movement. When they were rescued, the children had to be taught basic concepts about the outside world, including what sunlight was. Psychological evaluations revealed the severe trauma caused by prolonged confinement and abuse. During sentencing, the judge read out the punishments for each crime: life imprisonment for murder by neglect, 20 years for enslavement, 15 years for rape, 10 years for deprivation of liberty, 5 years for coercion, and 1 year for incest. Under Austrian law, the sentences were to run concurrently, with life imprisonment being the ultimate penalty. Fritzl was to serve his sentence in a facility for the criminally insane, reflecting the psychiatric evaluation's conclusion that he had a severe personality disorder, but was not insane in the legal sense. Dr. Kastner's report described him as having a combination of narcissistic and antisocial traits, driven by an obsessive need for control and domination. He was calculated, manipulative, and entirely aware of his actions and their consequences. Even in the stark, clinical language of the courtroom, the horror of the case was unmistakable. The testimony, the photographs of the cellar, the accounts from investigators and doctors, they all formed a picture of sustained cruelty over decades, hidden behind the facade of an ordinary suburban home in Amstetten. Neighbors had never suspected the nightmare beneath the garden, and Fritzl himself had lived a double life, presenting as a respectable retiree while his daughter and 3 of his children languished underground. The contrast between his public persona and his secret crimes was as chilling as the details of the abuse itself. Elizabeth and her children now live hidden from the world in a place few will ever know, where the cameras can't find them and the headlines can't reach. Their lives are carefully protected, so the children can grow up away from the shadow of their past, allowed to experience something resembling normality for the first time. For Elizabeth, the fact that she emerged from that cellar with her sanity intact still feels almost impossible to comprehend. Yet those who know her believe they understand why, because she wasn't entirely alone. She had her children, and they gave her a reason to endure. She built structure in a place designed to crush it. Every day she made the children wake at a set hour. She cooked breakfast. She ran her own version of a school, teaching them lessons to keep their minds active, giving them the illusion of a life beyond concrete walls. She tried to maintain not just survival, but a kind of domestic order, however fragile. It was her way of defying the man who had stolen everything else. Some have wondered if Josef Fritzl, twisted, controlling, and sadistic, might have believed he loved her in some warped fashion. But those closest to the case are clear. Fritzl was incapable of love. He could dominate, manipulate, and destroy, but real affection was beyond him. Still, in his mind, Elizabeth was like a second wife, a second marriage, a grotesque self-justification for decades of abuse. Those who knew him before the cellar was discovered remember him as cold and unlikable, even as a child. After the truth came out, that dislike solidified into something far deeper. There was no pity for him, no conflicted sentiment, only the certainty that locking him away for the rest of his life was the right outcome. His age meant he would die in prison, which for many felt like the only fitting end. Standing in the quiet streets of Amstetten, it's easy to forget the horrors that unfolded here. This is not a vast, anonymous metropolis where people disappear without notice. It is a small, sleepy town, the kind of place where neighbors greet each other and gossip over fences. And yet, beneath one of its houses, a hidden world of cruelty existed for nearly a quarter of a century, unseen by the people who passed by every day. The building where Fritzl was held after his arrest looms like a fortress. It has the same cold, unyielding presence as the prisons journalists have seen in far harsher corners of the world. To look at it is to be reminded that evil is not always loud or obvious. It can be buried deep, concealed under the appearance of respectability. Fritzl was, to many, a model citizen, a father, a husband, a man with standing in the community. That facade was the mask behind which one of modern history's most disturbing crimes was committed. Elizabeth's survival was not passive endurance. It was an active daily resistance against a man determined to break her. She shielded her children from as much of the nightmare as she could, teaching them, playing with them, giving them rituals and habits that tethered them to something human. It's that resilience, quiet, relentless, and unyielding, that kept them alive in more ways than one. For the people of Amstetten, the case shattered illusions about their town. For the wider world, it was a reminder that some of the darkest acts can unfold in the most ordinary settings, hidden behind the most ordinary doors. The story of Josef Fritzl will be studied and retold for generations, not just for the unfathomable cruelty of one man, but for the equally extraordinary endurance of the woman he tried and failed to destroy. If this story moved you, don't just close the tab and walk away. Stories like Elizabeth's remind us why we can't turn our eyes from the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And here we don't just tell stories, we build a community that refuses to look away. Whether you're watching from California's busy streets, the quiet suburbs of Ohio, the mountains of Colorado, or the small towns of Maine, your voice matters here. Every subscribe, every like, every share isn't just a number. It's another person saying, "I will not let these stories be forgotten." When you engage, you're part of a chain that makes sure the next person hears, learns, and maybe even acts. It's how we make sure that in places like sleepy Amstetten or anywhere, monsters don't get to hide behind closed doors again. So hit subscribe, share this with someone you know in Texas or New York or Florida, and let's keep this community loud, strong, and unafraid to speak the truth.